just so that we can demonstrate this and show this to other people who may be interested. So welcome everybody. If there's more people that will enter the room, I'll just load them in. I see some more people are coming in now. Welcome to the second Blackstone River Watershed Network meeting and webinar. It's fairly nice to finally meet some more people and get some watershed discussions going at a very interesting level, which is the very local fourth level watershed approach, which is usually about small communities, looking at what we've got and celebrating the ecosystems and diversity that we have, and then slowly taking a look at, what are the main issues? How do we support larger watershed initiatives? How do we support NGOs? And what can we do in our local area to sort of support these other initiatives and work on the ground? That's kind of where I always like to be, and it's on the ground doing things that people can see and feel and touch, and getting the community involved. So I'm going to kick off the presentation or the webinar just with I'm going to share my screen. Just bear with me for 1 second while that loads up. Right. If everybody can just let me know that they can see that presentation.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So we're going to just do a very short recap of what we discussed in the first presentation, just kind of what went on, and just a brief discussion. This is available, and I can send you a link to that first presentation or webinar. So the Blackstone River Watershed, this topic today will be our freshwater ecosystems from our headwaters right down to Georgian Bay. And this is obviously, I'm just presenting it from my local company side, which is called Freshwater Ecosystem Services. So what did we discuss last week? Basically setting up what this network is. It's a community-led non-profit organization representing a collaborative of local individuals, groups, community members, and organizations within the Blackstone River Watershed. Its aim was to provide an open, transparent, and collaborative opportunity for the Blackstone River Watershed to discuss key ecosystem issues as a community, engage each other, and then look at what we could do to support other organizations, and look at what a freshwater ecosystem approach is based on, and to look at climate change through some action. Everybody in a watershed has a vital role in this. We're all affected by climate change. We're all affected by what happens around us, and the historical knowledge, wildlife, and biodiversity concerns or ecosystem concerns, topics of discussion, and voicing key issues are all part of what needs to be set up. And I see there's a spelling mistake. And all participation is welcome by everybody. It's also volunteered and appreciated if people pipe up and ask questions. So feel free to raise your hand. There's a little emotions icon at the bottom of the screen. Just raise your hand, and at any point just pause or stop me and let's chat about things. So last week we discussed float paths, we discussed some ecosystem level zoning. We looked at sort of a mapping system across the watershed, available data that was there. And one of the things that we looked at was who's in charge from a sort of municipality level, and who are our councillors representative of all the different areas across the watershed, and some interesting topics about that. So here's a overview of our watershed. It sits within the Muskoka River Watershed. It's right in the northwest corner. It starts kind of up here at North Sandy Plain, well, in Humphrey, with Horseshoe Lake, and flows all the way down, obviously through the 400, down through the first, second, and third lake into Blackstone Lake, out into Crane Lake, and then out through the Massasauga Provincial Park into Georgian Bay. So it's a very small watershed. It's a very interesting one. And that's about it. So we're going to go into a meet and greet now. So I don't know if everybody wants to just unmute and just quickly give a chat, I will pause the presentation and just go back to the main screen quickly so we can all see it. Let's do that. And we'll start with Dan on my screen.
Hi, Dan McLeod, counselor for Ward 6, which is Healy Lake in Kapakog, which is just a little below, but we're interested in finding out what's happening. I do know, where'd she go? There's Katrina. I was in that seminar with her, I guess it was last week. It was very informative. So I'm looking forward to this one, and I apologize for the hair, but I got caught in the freezing rain.
Welcome, Dan. Next on my list is Norman.
Hi, everyone. I'm here as, I guess, a director of the Friends of the Muskoka Watershed and a retired limnologist who worked mainly on animal plankton, but in my retirement, I'm told I'm becoming a silviculturalist. And with Highway 400 running right through the watershed, it makes me want to look at the road salt levels upstream and downstream of the lake, and I may go back and look at, well, maybe Cameron, you would know more than me. If you have chloride levels above 10 or 20 milligrams per liter in the lakes downstream of 400 or right beside the 400, there's already probably damage happening in those lakes from that road salt. So just kind of here to express my interest. And I'm always interested in someone that's as actively engaged as Cameron is, just to see what he's about. So, okay.
Welcome, Norman. Thanks for that. Next on my list is Dominique from Seawood.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dominique O'Brien. I'm the Director of Community Services with Seawood Township. So part of my portfolio, I guess, is looking after our water quality program, which has been running for quite some time. We've also introduced an event program with Katrina as well now. And so we're looking at more opportunities to expand on our water quality program. And so we're looking at things like what Cameron's presenting today. I'm looking at what this is all about and how we can incorporate that into our programming.
Excellent. Thank you and welcome. Next on my list is Erik.
Hi there, I'm zooming in from the West Coast. And, Cameron and I connected via LinkedIn, and he's seen a few of my videos that I've put up, but talking about forests and watersheds and ecosystems and how they maybe are ace in the hole, let's say, or they produce a lot of ecological goods and services for free, and we're going to need them in all kinds of ways, help us out going forward to to slow down water in the landscape, get it into the ground as opposed to just running on runoff, and to see what is it that we can be doing and trying to see if we can move the needle in ecological, social, and economic possibilities as well too. So just trying to look after the ecosystem health, because that's the sort of our golden goose, and we want to make sure that it's firing on all cylinders kind of thing.
Excellent. Thanks and welcome, Erik. Next on my list is Katrina.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me all right through my my mask here at the office. I'm the Aquatic Conservation Programs Coordinator with the Georgian Bay Minnedoh-Gamey Biosphere. And we're interested in staying in the loop on Cameron's work here with the group, and like to see how we might be involved going forward.
Perfect. Thanks, Katrina, and welcome. Next on my list is Susan. I think she might still be on mute. Next on my list after her is Katie.
Hi, I'm Katie. I work with Norm at the Friends of the Muskoka Watershed. And I didn't really know what this was all going to be about, but here to learn. I run the citizen science program. And so anything that kind of connects to citizens and learning how to communicate with them about watershed issues is what I'm interested in learning about.
Perfect.
And
Thank you.
if Susan doesn't show up there, she works for or sorry, she's a volunteer and the, oh, there she is.
okay.
Hi, Susan. I'll let her talk now.
I wasn't sure if I was going to be visible on the screen. I'm president of a small environmental organization called Environment Haliburton in Haliburton, and we are very concerned with water quality, as we have 600 freshwater lakes in Haliburton County, and as someone else mentioned, they are our golden goose in our county as well.
Yes. Thank you very much, Susan and Katie. Welcome very much. There's a lot of other members that were invited, and hopefully as these meetings and webinars progress through 2022, we will get a lot more people involved. And so far, one of the things that I'd always like to do is just welcome everybody to the watershed. It's a very unique little watershed. Flows directly into Georgian Bay, and I love it. I live in the area, and the more I travel around it, the more I see just its amazing beauty. So thank you very much. I will go back to presenting my screen and continue with my section of the webinar. So, okay, can everybody see that? Okay, perfect. So what I wanted to talk about was, some of our freshwater ecosystems in the watershed. I'll start off with the upper watershed areas. As you can see, just about over here, this is where I stay in Humphrey, and it's sort of in the upper section of the watershed, just above, flowing down into Horseshoe Lake. If I put some elevation on here, you can kind of see that this upper watershed area is kind of around about the 286 meter, close to 1,000 feet above sea level. And in the midsection, or as it goes down towards the midsection, it drops down around about 80 meters or 260 feet down into this lower elevation here, just before, or flowing from Horseshoe Lake into First Lake, and then just before it flows into Second Lake. So what are the main ecosystems or freshwater ecosystems? As you can see mapped out on this, we've got a number of wetlands, creeks, we've got lakes, and what this looks like, that's a picture of a vernal pool up in the upper watershed area close to my house here. These are underground seeps that just sort of flow out into the watershed. And really, this is where the start of everything in the watershed happens. We have a lot of groundwater interchanges and groundwater to surface water sort of expressing itself in these pools. There are also remnants of snowmelt. We also have quite a lot of rainfall up in the upper catchment, and at this elevation we have quite a larger amount of snowfall. So this is where it all starts, and this is kind of one of the most important sections of a watershed, is your headwater streams. So what do some of these little vernal pools look like? Yeah, some pictures of just some that I've taken close to my house here. They're very tiny, they're very shallow. Some of them are there throughout the year. Some of them are just there for a few weeks, sometimes a few days. But they're important habitat for a lot of small invertebrates, salamanders, newts, and other smaller organisms that maybe get overlooked in some cases. There's also these tiny little creeks and drainage ditches. I'm sure many of you have seen these. They occur all over at different times of the year. Some are flowing permanently due to groundwater or some septic influences. Others dry up and disappear and just become a little dry drainage channel through some parts of the year. In the upper areas, we also have these upper lakes. Horseshoe Lake is a perfect example. We have beautiful areas around Horseshoe Lake, and this is just some of the habitats that I've taken some photos of. In the midsection of the lake, or in the midsection of the watershed, sort of downstream of Highway 400, we have Blackstone Lake and Crane Lake. there's quite a difference in elevation here from the previous for the upper section. We only drop roughly about 7 to 8 meters from sort of Second Lake all the way down through to the end of Crane Lake. So that's only about a 22 to 28 foot drop in elevation as we come down through the watershed. So slightly flatter area, and this is host to a different set of ecosystems. As you can see, we have quite a large number of wetlands, wetlands surrounding lakes and individual wetlands by themselves. We can see that there's a lot of dense vegetation in this. It gets baked in the sun in summer, and vegetation loves to grow in these slow moving hot climate or warmer areas of the watershed. Our lakes are also much bigger. We have a lot more water in these areas. And as you can see, some of it is quite dark in coloration, and others have this glorious shoreline habitat around most of them. As we move down into the lower, I also wanted to mention that this hosts a large array of freshwater species. We have wetland species, lots of invertebrates, lots of fish species, loons, ducks, bears, deer, moose, I mean, you name it. The Blackstone watershed has got, or Blackstone River's got a ton of species. As we move down towards Georgian Bay, the Blackstone River flows out into Blackstone Harbor here. The elevation changes are quite pronounced again. We drop another 20 meters, which is close to about between 80 and 90 feet as it comes down through from Crane Lake out through into Georgian Bay. And this hosts even a greater diversity of habitats, much larger lakes, very still water, and some beautiful ice in the winter. I've got a picture of the waterfalls as it flows down into Blackstone Harbor. So this is the Blackstone River coming down at the Massasauga Provincial Park. This is a fish sanctuary at the bottom of this waterfall. And out, as you go further, took a plane ride last year and kind of went out and looked at further areas as the archipelago starts to break off into Georgian Bay. So really beautiful areas, stunning habitats, and home to this diverse array of species that we're all very familiar with and love. Both our large animals, our insects, our tiny amphibians, our fish, our reptiles, birds. Yeah, there's a great array of shoreline vegetation species, lilies, trees, you name it. And that's kind of where I wanted to stop now, and we will take over from, or Erik will now take over from me and just talk about some of the other things related to the freshwater ecosystems here.
Okay, yeah, there's some neat science from the US Pacific Northwest about the importance of small wetlands and headwater areas that are super critical for keeping stream temperatures really cool. So these small wetlands, like Cameron was just showing there, even smaller than that, actually, 1.5 meters long, 30 centimeters across, and 30 centimeters deep, are hugely important for keeping streams cool and making sure that the temperatures are not going above that sort of 25 degrees Celsius lethal stage type thing. So that very important. Also, I'd suggest too that there's some research from Interior BC that's showing when you do a lot of clear cutting, what you're doing is you're creating the opportunity in those clear cut areas there for snow to really pile in, and you've taken away the forest cover. So all the shading capabilities, the slowing down of water, holding snow, and also shading snow then. So then when you get a warm rain front come in, then you've got these rain on snow events, and then that's when you get these big flooding events too. So above an area, they call it sort of 60% of the watershed that you find this elevation marker, but in interior BC, that about 1,500 meters high, that 60% of the water, 60% of the watershed is above this 860 line, and about 70 to 80% of the water from an entire watershed is coming from these headwater areas. So if you've changed the dynamics and you've changed the forest cover, you've really fragmented those landscapes, then those upper landscapes then are going to be providing tons and tons of water downstream, and less than the sort of the flatter or toe slopes farther down in the watershed. So they're so connected. And what I would suggest too is that the trees themselves are actually vertical watersheds, because you've got branches, you've got leaves, you've got needles, and you got moss and fungi in those layers too. So then they're all sort of directing and slowing down and moving water from the top of the tree down to the bottom. And then if you have the root systems and the fungal networks under the ground too, then you've got a lot of carbon storage there. You've got a lot of water being put into those systems. And by having an intact forest canopy, you're letting that water sort of drip down slowly, as opposed to running and hitting the ground and letting it get into the groundwater, as opposed to just running off in the surface. You know, that these ecosystems, they create a lot of ecological goods and services for us. At the very least, they're providing clean air through photosynthesis, storing carbon. They also filter water, create habitat, you know, store water, filter it for free. And as I suggest, like in the face of things like climate change, is that these ecosystems are going to help us mitigate or slow down the impacts of climate change by having those intact forest cover. So you have shading and cooling of the planet, which will help us also fight forest fires. You're providing that habitat, and you're making sure that this ecological system is storing carbon. As the trees get older, they're storing more and more carbon, and 70% of it is under the ground too. So you need these intact systems doing their jobs all the way through time. And you know, when we simplify forests, we make them younger, the trees grow really fast, but they're still not and you know, it may take many years for fungi species to come in after a forest fire or after logging or something like that. So that the older we can let these ecosystems get as well too, we're banking ecological time all the way along, so that they're firing on all cylinders, and so that we in the end don't have to pay, you know, tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars for water filtration systems, you know, because a lot of the things we need to do today to protect ourselves and to provide the services for citizens, these ecosystems do for free. So they can help us reach our mandates. A lot of the stuff that has slid down from the federal level and the provincial level is down now to sort of local municipalities. And then another group I'm involved with is called the Climate Caucus. So trying to help municipalities across Canada have come up with nature solutions, transportation solutions, water solutions that, you know, municipalities produce 50% of the carbon emissions across Canada. So if we can start at the local level, and we know our lands better at the local level, as the farther away you get away from the ground, the less you remember or know about these things. Like people in Ottawa and, you know, down in, you know, Toronto too, for the provincial level too, that the farther they get away, they seem to lose this local knowledge and to understand how things really work. So that's part of the system as well too that I'm interested in. But as well, I mean, that's just talking from a colonial perspective, but then we've got, you know, 10,000 years of you know, traditional ecological knowledge from First Nations too. So there's a huge effort now too to connect Western science and traditional ecological knowledge and move that forward as well, and manage these ecosystems in that fashion too. So there's all kinds of benefits to looking after these things from the local level, understanding them. And I was watching a neat presentation last night from the European Forestry Institute about these ecological goods and services and how we can incentivize private landowners, maybe bigger landowners, to do things differently, that we're looking after this ecological golden goose, and that it's doing all the jobs that we wanted to do and providing these ecological goods and service for us. Because I think that those ecological goods and services in these ecosystems, by looking after them, restoring them, is actually still going to cost us millions and billions, but it'll save us billions and trillions when we're trying to fight climate change and building seawalls. And so I would suggest that these ecosystems can help us do that in a much cheaper way if we make sure that they're firing on all cylinders, because we don't have millions or billions and trillions to spend on this. And if we spend some money, restore these ecosystems, it'll actually be cheaper in the end. And by doing some of these treatments like thinning forest for fire smart and fire prevention, we can also move those forests along their old growth development and those types of things. So there actually is some economic benefits too, because I think there's a lot of opportunity to restore these ecosystems, plant trees, put logs in streams, build, recruit beavers or create beaver-like structures in the forest to slow down water, and then do forestry differently. Instead of clear cutting, start thinning these forests for multiple objectives, which includes carbon sequestration, water filtration, old growth development, and habitat creation too. So there's an economic message to all of this as well too, that there's tons of work that needs to be done. And I think there's heaps and heaps of jobs, plus as well, collecting the data, using satellite data and analyzing this too. We need good data to be able to understand what we need to do going forward. So I think there's huge opportunity. There's huge challenges, and it often looks dire that people don't want to get up in the morning, but I think there's huge opportunities as well to look after these ecosystems and let them help us and try and fix up what we've been doing over the last, 180 years, let's say, in colonial times. So there you go.
Excellent. Thanks, Erik. And yeah, there's a lot of good things that we have in the Blackstone River Watershed. One of the things that I've noticed just looking at some of the imagery is just the amount of tree cover we actually have. If you start off with a system that looks like the GTA and it's just bricks and houses and pavement, it's going to cost us a lot more. But in an area like we have here, there's so much natural habitat. Although it's not pristine, it's not old growth, it's getting there. And that's one of the things that I would like to celebrate here in the Blackstone River Watershed is what do we still have? What phenomenal places do we still have in this watershed? What places are pristine? What places do we have any old growth? Are there remnants of it? What's the history of this watershed? One of the things that we may never work towards is going backwards in history, but we can move forwards in history and create something that would create a legacy for the rest of generations to come. I see, Norm, you've got a question. This is an open discussion format now. So yeah, let's hear your thoughts and let's go from there.
Okay, I want to thank Cameron, you and Erik for your thoughts, but remind everyone that local conditions really do vary, as Erik said. And so a couple of points to follow up from what Erik and Cameron have said. Yes, our forest canopy looks reasonably intact, but it's not pristine by any stretch of the imagination. And so just I'll make one comment, which is that the legacy of acid rain, as Cameron knows, he's heard me say, and Katie is on the call, we've identified calcium decline in the watershed caused mainly by acid rain, but by a bit also by historical logging, mainly acid rain. Has removed 0.5 ton of calcium per hectare from the soil. And the result of that is that the trees are not photosynthesizing at the rate that they should. They're more susceptible to wind damage. The wood is weaker. In this area, unlike Southern Ontario, that's cut most of their trees down, the best kind of nature-based solution we can maybe come up with would be to restore calcium levels in the soil so that we could get wood production rates, maple syrup production rates, carbon capture rates up where they would have been 100 years ago. And they're probably 20 to 50% lower than they should be because of this acid rain-induced calcium decline problem. The second, this is kind of a little more philosophical. Erik made wonderful reference to knowledge coming from tens of thousands of years of First Nations presence on the land. I'm old enough that I remember a time in Ontario when there was no Ministry of the Environment. So the professional government level study of environmental condition in Ontario goes back less than one professional lifetime to 1972. And we were already in the midst of very serious environmental problems in the 70s. And so nothing was pristine. As Erik also mentioned, multiple knowledge systems. So I'll just, if people haven't seen it, I'll just point out that if you go to the Muskoka Steamships and Discovery Center website, there's recordings of 5 webinars that just finished called The Best of Two Worlds, which was trying to find how we can find the best of First Nations and Western science approaches to knowledge generation related to environmental sustainability. This kind of stuff is going on everywhere, and it's wonderful. And the knowledge systems are very much place specific. So I found that webinar series very interesting. I organized it, so I shouldn't be surprised that I found it very interesting. But anyway, I learned a tremendous amount. When you know nothing, and I know nothing about First Nations approaches to knowledge, you can learn a lot in 5 hours. So Erik, I'm going to issue you one challenge to what you said that kind of has come from that webinar series, and that's related to the whole ecological services paradigm, which has been seen as one of the most useful moves in Western science towards environmental sustainability. But let's remember that it still places man at the highest point, being serviced by the environment. And that is absolutely not a First Nations approach to understanding how the world works. I asked Professor Chiblo, one of the First Nations webinar speakers, what she meant when she said that water should look after itself. And her answer was very revealing. What she said was, well, from our tradition, we believe that the Creator put things on earth with various purposes, and water has all kinds of jobs to do. It has agency, all kinds of jobs to do. And to provide habitat, cooling, food, water for all kinds of creatures. And one of those creatures is us. It's not there to service us, which is what the ecological services paradigm suggests, and that's the only thing that matters. But its first responsibility is set by itself to service all the ecosystems of the world that it supports and the creatures it supports. And I find that a very attractive paradigm. I don't know how popular it would be and how far we could go pushing such a paradigm when all of our laws are oriented entirely towards us. I had a wonderful argument with a lawyer a month ago, trying to argue that watersheds should have personhood. And he argued that that was just completely ridiculous because mankind has rights, but we also have responsibilities to look after nature. And I said, that just hasn't worked. We need to find a better way to do this, and maybe changing our paradigm might be a useful starting point. Anyway, that's
right. But that's a good point, because like in places like New Zealand, you've got rivers that have personhood, which then, because right now they're completely ignored. I mean, extractive industries don't have to account for their impacts on the land, those ecosystems or anything. It's zero-sum game for them. They don't have to track any of it. If they did, it'd be completely different if they had to account for what what they've done to the ecosystem. And there's that about these ecosystem services, nobody values them. So if you don't have to track them and look after them, then it's still, you can do whatever you want, and your industry doesn't have to account for that in whatever it is, oil and gas or forestry or those kind of things. So there's a thing called the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative across Canada, and where they're trying to actually value these ecosystem services. You know, how much carbon, like they say, like an urban tree stores $200 worth of carbon per year. And what, you know, for water filtration and natural ecosystems and those kind of things. So there's one way to be plugged into this too, is because they're actually talking to, and I don't have the name right, but the national accountants system and agency in Canada, where they're trying to get these natural assets then identified as units, and then what are their value increasing, you know, through time. And that's sort of somewhat different from, say, carbon credits, but still that there is no value to these natural ecosystems. So we have to get a figure on that too. And there's a whole thing called donut economics, as to your point, Norman, that about the demand at the top of the chain, and these services are this there for us. But this donut whole economics is that the first layer is these ecosystems, the golden egg, that then on top of that is social, and then, you know, and smaller circles, and the smallest circle on top of that then is the economics, right? But you deal with you go from the ecological to social, and then to the economic up on top, but, you know, smaller and smaller circles. But the biggest circle on the bottom is these ecosystems and those ecological goods and services that they produce. So I don't want to go too far down that road, because that's a huge discussion. But what I would say though too is that, and I hope you're hearing me, because that sounds like my internet's a little bit winky today, but about calcium. So calcium is important for cedar trees out here in the West Coast, and I'm sure elsewhere, that cedar trees don't do well without the calcium, and that they have difficulties in getting water to the tops of the trees without calcium. And so that's why you see a lot of the dead tops on cedar trees too. So that's very interesting what to do with the acid rain and the calcium and that importance. And they have said that, and cedar growing together, that the cedar tree is sort of a calcium pump for the Douglas fir, which maybe then helps the Douglas fir, but then creates that system where it has difficulty in getting moisture up to the top of its canopy type thing. So yeah.
I want to obviously give other people a chance to say,
Absolutely.
But can I just say two follow-up things, Cameron?
Yeah.
And this is about trees. So there is every possibility there's a link between calcium supply of the forest and the risk of spring floods. And I'll tell you that spring floods is one huge issue here in the watershed. And that's because a quarter of all the, we get a meter of rain, a quarter meter evaporates, a quarter meter transpires, and that leaves half a meter for all of our waterfalls and lakes and things like that. But that quarter meter that transpires is lower than it should be if the trees weren't calcium limited. There's been probably about a 25% reduction in transpiration rates because the forest is calcium limited. So there may be a link to flooding because there's probably too much water sitting on the land in the fall when it freezes up. So that's something that's just being studied now. The other thing that people in this area care about really deeply, Erik, is just water quality, and everyone on this phone call has pretty well made mention of that. And I'll just mention the role of trees in that too, very specifically, and that's kind of phosphorus related. And most of the phosphorus in our watersheds is actually tied up in the trees. So for example, if you put in flood control culverts, which was done before the MOE existed in the 30s, and the culverts were too small and backed up water, and we saw these standing dead black spruce trees and wetlands and stuff, they slowly lost all their nutrients out of that dead standfall, and that resulted in an initial huge pulse of phosphorus to the landscape. And that took decades to recover. Amazing work done at the Dorset Environmental Science Center over the last 40 years has tracked this long-term slow recovery from that pulse of dead tree phosphorus that came probably in the 30s and the 40s. So it's taken half a century for our watersheds to recover. So another point I'd like to make is we need to look at all timescales. You know, we have short timescales for road salt issues and things like that. But when we start to think about the role of healthy forests on the watershed, we've got to think long-term.
Excellent, thanks, Norm. Yeah, and that sort of ties in very well with cumulative effects over the last couple hundred years of colonial and settler history here. I think of the three great deforestation events in our watershed, going back to the white pines, then the oaks, and then the rest of the maples and the other trees that we have in this watershed. And throughout the watershed, you see growth that is roughly about 50 to 70 years old. So there's quite a few changes that have happened in this watershed. And, you know, you talk about phosphorus, you talk about calcium. These are issues that are long-standing, especially when you deforest an area. You have this massive pulse of dead material, the soil dies underneath it, all that vegetation and humus dies. And that slowly filters down into our lakes, and that goes into our sediment beds. And as temperature changes, these things start to, you know, historical events start to come back to haunt us. Next, Daniel, you wanted to have something to say?
Yeah, I would, and thank you very much for all the input. We have had, I'm talking to the MNR, FNS, and whatever their label is now. We have had somebody come in and do using some of the forest for a wood lot. They're harvesting logs and everything else. And some of my constituents have come back to me and said, well, I mean, it looks like a monsoon went through just lying all these trees flat. So what they've done is they've taken a good part of the trunk and left the top lying on the ground. I mean, some of these tops are like this big around. And I was told, and I'm directing this to Norman and to Erik, I was told that the little branches on these trees, if they're left on the ground, put the nutrients back into the soil. Okay. But I mean, they're on trunks like this big around. The other thing too, I was told that with the trunks lying on the ground, they will absorb water and put water back into the soil should there be a drought. Is that correct? Okay. The other thing too, getting back to, looking at the map, our Healy Lake is just right at the border of your watershed. And if you're fortunate enough to be on our lake, if you go up one of the fingers at the very end, you will come across, I'm not kidding you, there's a swamp in there that's the size of 16 football fields. It is huge. And being on the water committee, I used to be the president of the Cottage Association and then moved over to the water. Our water quality on this lake is phenomenal. I mean, obviously we wouldn't trade it for anything. The only real thing we have to put up with is the tannis, you know, like the yellow coloring, but other than that, it's fine. The only other point I'd like to make too is that old habits are dying hard. I remember as a kid, and I'm ashamed to admit it, but you used to dive into the lake, crawl up on the dock, soap down, and then jump back into the lake. I mean, and everybody did it. Everybody didn't know about the hazards, but now nobody does that anymore. Everybody is very particular about where the garbage goes and everything else. So we are, in my opinion, heading towards the right direction. It may be a little slower than everybody likes, but we are heading in the right direction. Those are my points.
Excellent points, Dan. And yeah, I can definitely agree. It's we've definitely seen a positive change in communities' appreciation for what we have. And I definitely have seen that both at the Seguin Township level and Archipelago, as people are really starting to invest in, you know, what's going on, who's doing what, how can we improve things? And that really gives me hope for what we're trying to achieve here. And that's coordinate a lot of these efforts. You know, right downstream of us is Georgian Bay, and I'm glad Katrina's on here, because what happens in this watershed goes straight into Georgian Bay, and that affects, you know, this massive UNESCO site, this biosphere of intense biodiversity and beauty. So cleaning up what we do, having an idea of what happens in our watershed, where we can sort of focus some efforts, I think is definitely a way to go for our community to come together. And it supports all the other watershed programs that are happening at a larger scale. So it's all part of the puzzle. And it's fantastic to be a part of this. I'm a freshwater ecologist, so my idea of, how these things are integrated all depends on water. If I think of trees are, 60 to 70% water. Animals, we're sacks of water. Some of us walk on 2 legs, some of us walk on 4, or many more. But whatever you have in nature, and humans included, if you prick us, we bleed. Same with trees, and that mostly is consisting of water. The whole system is a water pump, and it's phenomenal to see how local forest ecosystems actually create water and atmosphere. They create small climatic zones, and that sort of gives you an idea of, when you take a watershed at its whole, that's 30% that's remaining. Only 10% is what we see in surface water. The rest flows underground in various aquifers, both sort of short-term shallow aquifers, and right down deeper into much more long millennial or even thousands of years old water. And that all slowly seeps from the top of our catchment or watershed down into Georgian Bay, obviously going all the way down into the St. Lawrence system and out into the Atlantic Ocean. So the scalable approach for watersheds, it's an ecosystem scalable approach from sort of these large areas right down to, the individual stream that runs through the back of my house, or both little streams. And they're not even mapped. So even our maps that we have, our GIS systems, are incomplete. A lot of them are based on very old topographical maps from the 1960s and 1970s. Even more intuitive is how that's sort of been played through LiDAR and digital elevation modeling to sort of start to look at how these systems work on an elevation scale. We know that the sort of depressions in grounds could be wetlands, but they could be vernal pools. They could be extremely important for some certain species in our watershed. So putting all these things together and collaborating as a group is just one way to sort of celebrate this, find out what's going on, and as a community start to focus on, what can we do? Where can we put efforts? It's great to see township leadership as well in this, to be able to say, this is what we want to do. We've got a vision, and we can focus on it very specifically. Is anybody else got any points before we move on to the next section?
I have a couple more points if nobody else wants to talk.
Yeah. Go ahead, Erik.
Okay. To do with the evapotranspiration of plants too, that in California, in the redwoods, they, the big old growth redwoods, so they think, well, they were sucking up tons and tons of water, that there would be more water in the ecosystem if they cut down those trees. And they found out that there was a 30% decrease in the water in that watershed because you had the needles of the coast redwoods condensing fog then into moisture and letting that drip down slowly. But then, as Norman was mentioning too, that these and Cameron has too, that these trees and these plants are storing water. So it also turns out that younger trees, because they're growing faster, photosynthesizing faster, that they actually release more moisture than used to. So there would be more, as Norman was giving us the numbers there too, about 50% of it going. Well, if you have older forests, they will transpire less quickly and won't release as much moisture up into the atmosphere. So that helps you too by letting forests get older and older and older. And then to Daniel's comment there too about logs on the ground, well, those logs are water sponges, and they will absorb, as they're decaying, they're also absorbing moisture, and then they can let it out through the season when it's drier into the summertime. Plus, if those logs get burned, then they'll store more moisture and more nutrients. It's like a big, huge biochar system. Like people are doing that in farming these days too. But in a lot of these fire ecosystems, and probably any forest is really a fire ecosystem, but to have those logs burned and then wetted by winter rains, they'll absorb more moisture and more nutrients. So that's hugely important. And then some recent research in California which is counterintuitive, that if you let forest fires burn a little bit more uncontrolled than they would, there was a 30% increase in water storage in that ecosystem too, because it's all about that biochar kind of system too. So you need fires as well. And a lot of the tree species in our ecosystems need fire. They're fire dependent species. So that also helps us from a water storage capability as well too, that there's increases in water storage in that ecosystem because we let fire come back. And that's one of the restoration treatments that we're going to have to probably start doing as well too, because we've been putting out fires for at least the last 110 years since the big burns in Idaho and Montana in 1910. So there's a whole bunch of things that we could be doing to help these ecosystems fire on all cylinders. So letting them do their natural jobs and help us out in many avenues.
Excellent points, Erik. Yeah, and that all contributes to water quality. It contributes to all the things that our biodiversity needs to function. If you think about clean, clear water, anybody who walks around this watershed will know there's a lot of water. It's a wet system. You can't step anywhere in any time of the year without stepping in a puddle or losing your shoe in some mud. So it's very complex, but it's very simple at the same time. You know, everything depends on what's around us to function and to survive. And you know, we have some really charismatic species that are totally water dependent. I think of beavers and kingfishers as two perfect examples. You know, most people would never say that they're freshwater species, but that's exactly what they are. They depend 100% on freshwater species or freshwater ecosystems for their survival, for their daily functions. We know from our local First Nation groups and communities that this is Turtle Island. And if you think about the Blackstone River Watershed, this is the turtle habitat. You know, we have thousands and thousands of turtles crossing our system, you know, on a daily basis in the summer and spring and fall, and then overwintering in deeper habitats. You know, this is a miracle of nature. So I love this watershed. It's great to see that, and thank you very much for all participating. The last section, which I'm just going to briefly show you, is just kind of talking about, you know, what we can do, events and plans for 2022. And I'll try to make this short as time's starting to run out, but kind of looking across the year and figuring out, you know, what can we do as a group to sort of promote awareness and promote what we want to try and discuss and inform ourselves with here. So various meetings kind of, you know, formalizing what the Blackstone River Watershed Network is, you know, who's involved, we were key members, distribution list for emails, and whose participation could potentially be vital. We have a couple of lake associations. I've sent some invites out to them as well, but really getting community involved from our larger organizations within the watershed, and to start to support other initiatives within our watershed as well. Workshops, one of those things that I really like to do is on the ground workshops. I'd like to host one of the first ones at my property up in the upper headwaters here. This will be the second year that I've taken the 4.5 acres of the property and given it back to the wilderness, going wild, a little bit of rewilding. And I really want to show people, you know, the difference between, you know, where we started off and kind of where we're going this year. Watershed tours, I'd like to do a bicycle tour or a kayak tour, various tours throughout the year, kind of demonstrating and inviting people along to come and see how this watershed works. Starting sort of at the top of the watershed and working our way down to Georgian Bay, inviting various members and organizations to come and partake in that. Underwater video surveys. This is something that I do professionally as well as amateur level. I look at, you know, what's going on under the water. It's an unseen and hidden world to most people. You know, a lot of people, you know, will go to the edge of the lake or sit at a stream and fish, but not many people actually, you know, dive down deep and find out what's going on underneath that, because it's an entire world, just like, you know, coral reefs and marine environments. We have a fantastic amount of biodiversity and habitat under the water. I'm also promoting an eDNA freshwater biodiversity study. This is going to be a validation study for a methodology as part of the eBioAtlas program, which is a global inventory of biodiversity using eDNA metabarcoding. And this year we're going to start here in this watershed, kind of looking at what biodiversity we have by taking water samples and analyzing the DNA in the water. Ecosystem restoration projects. One of the first ones I'm looking at in my project is to take one of those tiny culverts that was never designed for ecosystems and trying to change that into something that actually benefits the ecosystem. Looking at marginal vegetation or habitat as migratory corridors for salamanders. The creek is non-fish bearing, but it has a host of other species that depend on that functionality. And obviously we can look at other restoration projects or initiatives across the watershed as well. Watershed support activities. The Muskoka River Watershed has, or the Muskoka Watershed Council has a number of activities that it's involved in. Our councils are involved with IceCap. Georgian Bay Biosphere Reserve has many activities as well. Our First Nation groups and communities around the area are also actively involved. So how can we support these activities? How can we include these people? And how can we get a functioning collaborative process happening here where we celebrate, we inform ourselves, and we work together? And then lastly, a river network community barbecues. I'm also going to host the first one. It's come and have a fire up at the top of the watershed. Come and have a look at how flows flow down into Horseshoe Lake, and how what we do at our own property or our own workplace affects those people downstream of us and potentially upstream. So it's a great way for community members to get together, share a meal, and talk about some interesting things. And I'm hoping to host a couple of international or even interesting presentations at these barbecues as well. Kind of, put a projector up and have somebody talk to us about some really interesting things. So that's kind of just an events plan. Nothing's scheduled, nothing's booked, but I wanted to put that out there and just get some feedback, and slowly as we go through the year, start to arrange and schedule these events. And last but not least, that's the end of this webinar. So open discussion for the last couple of minutes, and then we'll close off.
I just want to thank everybody for their input. It was very informative. It was again, I'm looking at you people, and you've got a lot more experience in it than I do. So I'll be the one asking the stupid questions.
Excellent, thanks, Dan. There's no stupid questions when it comes to ecology. We're all learning. I've spent 20 years doing this, and if I ever say that I've learned enough, that's a lie, because you never learn anything. I've only just scraped the tip of the iceberg when it comes to my knowledge, and I don't think, even if I was 80 years old, I don't think I'd even know half of it. So collectively putting together knowledge over history, our First Nations and Métis communities, their knowledge and traditional knowledge, I think is going to really be an eye-opener for a lot of people. I'm happy to learn and grow. And, already chatting with Norm and Erik and people on this call already, over the last couple of years, this has been a huge learning curve for me. So what I want to do is take that further this year and kind of showcase what we've got here, learn from this ecosystem, kind of identify what's going on, and start to put together this collective history and knowledge so that people can benefit from it. And if there's anybody else with questions or comments.
No, it's just a delight. Thanks to everyone. I learned a lot and still do. Daniel, I'll just tell you, mentioned tannins. Just as an example where things are always changing. So on average, Muskoka lakes are a lot browner now than they were 40 years ago. So that's a long-term natural pattern we don't fully understand, maybe related to recovery from lake acidification, maybe climate change related. But it's nothing to be afraid of. It's not a bad thing,
It's, if I can just expand upon that just a bit. If you go up the main channel, if you look behind the boat, it's a nice white, clear wake. And if you go into a little channel, or a little bay across the way here, every time you drive around in there, and sure enough, that wake is like brown, like brown sugar. And I presume and basically we do the water testing there too, and it's fine. It's just a different color.
Yeah, Muskoka lakes range from clear to brown.
Yeah.
Most lakes in the world range from clear to green, depending on how many nutrients there are, but that's not the pattern in Muskoka. So,
Okay, thank you. I didn't know that.
Yeah, just to add to that, I grew up in an area where we used to call the river the Coca-Cola River because it was brown like Coca-Cola, and it was natural. There was no anthropogenic impacts on that water at all. And I remember growing up, always, afraid of this black water. And who knows, maybe that's why the Blackstone River is called the Blackstone River in the first place.
Yeah.
So there's a bunch of information that I think, we're going to learn about this system. And I think, there's a lot of people across the watershed and across the communities that have some really deep understanding and historical information about this watershed. So yeah, thanks to everybody. I will definitely be putting together some scheduling and hopefully hosting another webinar soon. So thank you very much to everybody. I really appreciate the comments and efforts. And yeah, we look forward to meeting you guys again soon.
okay. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. I'll stop.